Let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer, and we'll start our Bible study this morning. Our Father, as we come to you and we study your word, in the past, your people had the privilege of walking with you during the times of the disciples. Paul had the privilege of being met and taught by you after his conversion. And today we have your word and the leading of your Spirit. So we ask today that the Spirit of God will lead us in the word, give us insight that we might have greater faith. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, last week we left off in the arrest of Paul, and then he was going to be held. But prior to that, of course, he had first met one of his goals in his ministry, and that was to return to the city of Jerusalem. And there he actually, do you recall we talked about how these four men had pledged and was making a holy pledge, and it required being purified, in essence, before in the temple. And so Paul says, okay, you know what, I'll do that too. And we thought, well, Paul, why would you do that? But now we're thinking, Paul actually uses that as part of his defense later on in chapter 24. So we'll see that. So all things kind of work out for God, in the will of God. So as we progressed, then all of a sudden the Jews from Asia literally attack him, and accuse him of violating the temple. And the words there in 23, and I'll get those verses for you in a minute so that you can refer to them. Their accusations before the high priest was that he had defiled the temple. It wasn't that he was trying to, but they're saying he did defile the temple. So we'll see how important that particular word is also in Paul's defense later on when he's before the governor Felix. And so he's attacked, and the commander there literally has to send in troops to forcibly remove Paul from the crowd. And according to Luke, it said, in fear that they might be pulling him apart. So that's pretty fierce, where they're grabbing a hold of him and pulling and trying to hurt him, this type of thing. And so he's removed, and he now goes before Felix, who's now held him in prison. So we'll start here in verse 19 through 22. Now, oftentimes Luke only refers to Claudius Lysias as the commander. But Claudius Lysias was in fact his name, the commander who had finally decided to take Paul before Felix. Okay? So in verse 19 it says, then the commander, Claudius Lysias, took him by hand, went aside, and asked privately, what is it that you have to tell me? Oh, I'm sorry, we'll catch you up here too. As you recall, there was the 40 people who had banned and made the pledge that they would not drink or eat until they had killed Paul. So then Paul is basically saved again by this ambush being exposed, and therefore Claudius then says, well, wait a minute, I can't allow this to happen. So he takes half of his army, 470 men, to protect one person. Isn't that interesting? But we must also remember that what's going on during this time? This 40 could have easily been turned into hundreds, because there was constantly this rival that between the Jews and the Gentiles. There was a tremendous rival. And this rivalry kept building and kept building and kept building until all of a sudden you had the Great Revolution that occurred in 60, I better raise this mic, huh? Then the Great Revolution that occurred in 67 through 70, where the temple was actually burned and destroyed. So now, so here Paul has been taken into jail, and Claudius Lysias is advised of the plot to kill him. And that's verse 19. Here we go. Then the commander took him by hand, went aside, and asked privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither act nor eat nor drink. They will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now that they are ready, waiting for that promise from you." So they're saying they're waiting, this 80 plus people, they're waiting for Claudius Lysias to say, okay, fine, I'll bring him down, I'll let you guys jump us and blah, blah, blah. So the commander let the young man depart and commanded, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." So Claudius assigns the soldiers, and in verse 23, it says, "And he called for 2 sentries, saying, Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And so that's kind of where we left off last week. So here we find that Paul has now safely been taken before Felix in Caesarea. And then during this time, there were remember I told you about the Jewish uprisings and everything. So then there is a letter that is sent to Felix. And this letter is sent by the commander who was in Jerusalem. Remember, Claudius Lysias. And this is verses 26 through verse 30. "To the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman." Notice, too, that this letter here, Claudius is really softballing it. He is wanting to make sure that everybody, especially the Roman government, that they know that he's the one that protected this Roman citizen, and he's the one that prevented him from being killed without being judged. So his letter is really softballing a lot of this to show him to be the hero, which in fact he was actually. "And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded, his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. So what Claudius is doing here is he's saying, not only am I sending Paul before Felix, but I am commanding the high priest and the Sadducees and those who have accused Paul of these things to also appear before Felix. So Paul is sent to Caesarea, and there we learn that over time, from somewhere around 60 AD, he was sent there. And so he spent about 15 days or so with Claudius before they sent him to Felix. So he had been in prison there. And then from there, then he goes on before Felix. And we'll find that when Felix takes the charge of him, although he's treated pretty fairly, but yet he is there for 2 years, in prison for 2 years. This puts this right into the early 60s AD. And so somewhere starting in his imprisonment there, throughout his imprisonment, and jumping ahead a little bit here in Rome for another 2 years, most people believe that the books of Luke and Acts were written by Luke, because Luke was with him constantly. Okay? And Paul at this time was about 58 years old. Okay? So now Paul is safely delivered to the governor Felix, and in verses 23 through chapter 23, verses 31 to 35, then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And the next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and return to the barricades. So they went far enough out of Jerusalem that they felt they were safe. So they sent back about 2/3 of the army. When they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor Felix, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Let's take a look at Felix now, because Felix is going to have a lot to do with what happens to Paul. And what's Felix's background? And why was Felix so interested in where he was from? So Felix actually was a slave. And we heard back in the earlier chapters of the freedmen. Do you remember that term, the freedmen? This was a sect of the freedmen that were getting heavily involved in the synagogue. And they were a group of slaves who had been freed by the Roman government. And so here, Felix, once being a slave, has now risen to the position of governor over Judah. And it says here in Acts 6:9 actually talks about them. It says, then there arose some from what is called the synagogue of the freedmen. You can look more in Acts in regards to that. But they were there during the disputing with Stephen. Okay, and you remember Stephen was stoned, was killed. And Felix was in power from AD 52 to AD 60, so approximately 8 years. In the historical books written back in then, Josephus was a very well-known and honored historian writer. Now let me explain this too. I am not saying he's part of the canon of the Bible. But during those days, just like we have today, we have people who are interested and dedicated to maintaining history. It seems like in his writings and the studies of his writings that he was more straightforward in what was truly happening. He wasn't trying to hide things to make one party or the other look better. And so a lot of theologians refer back to his historical letters. And he described Felix as, he describes him as highly immoral and cruel. And we'll find that that's pretty true. And later on in Felix's rule, he was accused of using disagreements between the Jews and the Syrians. And he used this disobedience to attack them and then to rob the spoils of those that he had killed during this disturbance. And so there was a lot of things that Felix was pretty immoral person. And as we study, we'll see that. But it also, because of the fact that he was once a slave and from the same areas where Paul was raised, he's familiar with this. And he's also quite familiar, not only because of where he came from, but also the fact that he has been raised as a Jew. So he was very familiar with Jewish law, okay? His brother, and we'll find later too, that his brother, Paulus, is Pallas, who was also a slave, but was very favored by the Emperor Nero. And we know exactly how wicked Nero was. And Paulus would kind of look over and after Felix. And as Felix would be accused of all of these different immoral acts and things, and many of them against the Roman Empire law, then Paulus would go to Nero and say, hey, he's my brother, he's still young, kind of, give him a break a little bit. And so he was allowed to stay in power for quite some time, 8 years. But at the end of that 8 years, he will be relieved. And we'll see here that in chapter 24 that he was relieved of his power and was sent to Rome to stand trial and was actually found guilty. However, because of Pallas again, he wasn't put to death, he wasn't hung, but he disappears. Nobody ever hears about him anymore. So now we're in chapter 24. And this brings us now to Paul's trial before Felix. So here he is standing trial. It's been a few days, actually 5 days since he arrived. And so the high priest has brought, and some of the high priests of that day, or the high in the synagogue, they all came to testify against Paul. And they also brought a lawyer. So, and his name was Tertullus, okay? And so he gives evidence in regards to this. But listen to Tertullus's opening statements in verses 2 through 4. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusations, saying, seeing that though you were enjoyed great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg for you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us. Tertullus knows the reputation of Felix, and so you know that this stuff is just kind of trying to win him over to their side. And you can't blame him. He's a prosecuting attorney in essence, and so that's what he wants to do. Then he files the charges in verses 5 through 6. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the whole world. Now he's referring to the Roman world, of course. And a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and he seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. Interesting here in his opening statement that he said tried to defile the temple. When the Jews from Asia took Paul before the high priest, they used the word did defile the temple. And so now they're changing their story a little bit here. And there's good reason for it, as we'll find out. That in verses 5 through 6, it says, for we have found this man a plague, a creator of decision among all the Jews throughout the world. Now, this here is one of the higher laws that actually pertain to Roman law, and that is dissension. When you start causing problems, when you start causing riots, that is a violation of Roman law, because their main goal is to keep peace and not to have this type of dissension. But we find out that in Acts 21:27, referring back, it says, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. It wasn't Paul that started the riots. It was the Asian Jews that started the riots. And Paul will use this defense later because we'll find, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but the witnesses that shows up to testify against Paul turns out to be zero. None of the witnesses, the high priest or the Sadducees council, witnessed any of this stuff. But they sure wanted Paul dead. That was their goal. They threw the commander Claudius Lysias. They threw him kind of under the bus here, because they were accusing him of coming in and breaking up this lawful judgment to kill Paul. And that he came in there with mighty force and forced them to let go of Paul. So they're kind of saying, Felix, we were doing right, but your commander, he was wrong. He didn't back us. He came in with force and ripped Paul out of our hands when we had already judged him and were ready to sentence him. And we seized him in verse 6, latter part of 6, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander came by and with great violence took him out of our hands. So there they kind of throwing him under the bus. And it was no intentions to judge Paul. I mean, Paul hardly got any words out of his mouth until he was ordered to be slapped. And the judgment had occurred at that point. But isn't it interesting, though, that at the conclusion of that, and prior to Paul being taken away by the commander, that the Pharisee says, whoa, this man, we don't find any problem with him. We find no violation of law, because Paul had presented himself as being a true believer in the laws of Moses and of the prophets and of resurrection. And therefore the Pharisees are saying, we agree with all that. So you find that in his trials before Felix, the Pharisees are absent because they find no favor. But they're not there testifying for him either. Okay? So now Paul offers his defense. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself." Paul's acknowledging and relying on Felix to remember his teachings and his experience with Jewish law. Then in verse 11, he addresses the most serious charge of dissension. "Because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship, no one could incite riots and start a violation in 12 days. And so that's what Paul is saying. And that I was there for 12 days, and later on it had come out that 7 of those 12 days he was in worship. And he was trying to deliver alms. We'll find out more about that in a second. It's a hanger that you guys don't leave, okay? And then in chapter 12, "And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogue or in the city." So now he's calling out those charges. And if you notice that because the Jews of Asia, who were the accusers, didn't show up to the trial, and therefore the high priest can't testify to it, and the council of the Sanhedrins, they can't testify to it because they didn't bring those charges and they didn't see those charges. And for them to bear false witness would be a greater crime than what they're accusing Paul of. And so they're kind of standing in the background. And so in verse 13, "Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me." Very strong. And so Paul's rebuttal now is in 14 through 16. "But this I confess to you, that according to the way," which in other words the Christian belief, "which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that they will be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense before God and men." Here again, Paul is now saying the very same thing that got him slapped in the mouth. I have a clear conscience before God. But now it's saying this before Felix, and he's saying why he can say that. He believes, right along with the Pharisees, everything right up to one thing, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, in verse 17, now after many years I came to bring alms, offerings to my nation. Here Paul, in this verse, is also saying, I didn't just come to worship, but I came to bring alms. Well, let's go back to Romans 15, 25 through 27. But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it is pleased those from Macedonia and Arcadia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleases them indeed, and they are their debtors, for the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things. Their duty is also to minister to them in material things. So the alms that Paul was referring to was one of the main purposes for Paul returning to Jerusalem. The droughts, the poor conditions of many of the Jews in Jerusalem were terrible. And Paul had been taking offerings from the various Gentile churches during his ministry in the third mission. And it was his purpose not only to go back to Jerusalem to be with the church and meet the members of the church in Jerusalem and their people, but the other purpose was to bring alms. Neither of those things are in violation of Roman law, nor are they even in violation of Jewish law. For even the Jewish law says to take care of the poor. And so you see here that he's saying, this is why I'm here, to worship God and to bring alms to the poor that I have collected over my years in the ministry. And these are why, too, the alms were so important to Paul, is that, number one, we've talked about the uneasiness between the Jews and the Gentiles, especially in Jerusalem. This helps these Jews who are holding and harboring some of these ill feelings towards the Gentiles. All of a sudden, here's all of these gifts of money to help them during these times. And where is this money coming from? New Gentile Christians. Great influence to help resolve some of the issues. And you remember too, one of the other issues was that these Gentile Christians weren't being circumcised. That had been settled, but there were still some that were thinking, that they were still in violation of Roman law or of Jewish law. So this was an important thing for Paul, and it was one of his main reasons. In chapter 24, verse 18, in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me, now I'm kind of jumping back and forth here, but now we're still back to his defense. The Jews from Asia found me purified, ceremonially clean in the temple, neither with a mob nor with a tumult. Isn't it interesting that the 4 men who had gone with Paul in taking this oath and this vow before God went to the temple to be purified, to be sanctified, and that their oath would be seen as a following and an obeyer of the Mosaic laws. So now he's got 4 people that could testify if they need to. But he's saying, they found me, and this was the condition in which they found me. I was not bringing unclean people into the temple. I was there to be purified and sanctified myself. Or excuse me, not sanctified, ceremonially clean. So Paul's starting to lay out his defense, just one at a time here. Verse 24, 19 through 20. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Now he's calling out, if these Jews from Asia have anything against me, why aren't they here? And he's looking at Felix right straight in the eye. If they're the ones that are accusing me, why aren't they here? Why aren't they present? Why isn't the high priest standing right there, as well as the Sanhedrin council right there? How come they're not saying anything? And in verse 21, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. So he brings it down to just that simple non-Roman law concern, strictly, and not even a concern of half of the synagogue, the Pharisees. They've already found him without guilt. So he says, this is the only thing that's left that they might even try to confuse or convict me of. And yet it is in itself not even against the law. Verse 22 through 23. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, very important again, isn't it? And Luke is trying to make it very clear that Felix is very knowledgeable in the Jewish way, very knowledgeable. Having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Cyrus, the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. There's a lot right there. And remember, a lot of this stuff that I'm telling you is things that the Bible has not explained. Therefore, but it has provided history and a close enough evidence to evaluate things to a certain extent. Remembering all along the time when I say these things that we are seeking to know the will of an invisible God. We will not know all of it until we're up there with him. So what I'm saying here, a lot of this I'm taking from reading some of the historical books and findings. I'm taking from human behavior. I'm taking from actions and characteristics of people like Felix, okay? So, but you can also look at what the Roman law was and what the Jewish laws, because a lot of this is documented. The Jewish law, obviously, a lot of that is documented right there in the first 5 books of the Bible. And we can find right there in the first full books of the Bible where Paul uses some of that we brought this up last week, uses that to testify why he called the priest a whitewashed wall. Is because he wasn't acting like a priest according to the laws of Moses, right? So, Felix's fairness towards Paul, and believe me, this was a pretty fair judgment in a way, was surprising and pretty much out of character. Because the main concern for Felix is to keep peace in Rome, or in Jerusalem, I'm saying, where he's in charge. He's the governor. And that is, if he screws up there, he's gone. And he knows that because he's been in trouble before, okay? So Felix's fairness towards Paul was somewhat of a surprise there, because here you have the high priest saying, whoa, wait a minute, you're keeping him? We don't get to take him back and judge him and kill him? That's what they're thinking. But Felix is saying, because he had great knowledge of the movement of the way, he was going to keep Paul. And he was going to keep him until he had time to talk with the commander. Well, 2 years later, he had never talked to the commander, because 2 years later, Paul was still in prison. But the advantages to what his orders were, number one, he said, for the guards to allow Paul's friends to visit him and to bring provisions for him. This did two things. Number one, when you're put in prison, the clothes that you have is the clothes that you're going to have for whatever amount of time you're in prison. The food that you get is going to be just enough to maintain life, and it's probably going to be the scraps that were left from the Roman guards' tables. So here, Paul is now being provided by his friends clean clothes to wear, good fresh food to eat. The other thing that it does, and you look kind of in there, the tradition too, although it was slightly against the law, nothing was ever enforced, kind of like some of our courts are today. The guards would say, hey, you want me to let your friends bring you some food? It's going to cost you some money. So there was a lot of bribery that would take place. But because he was now the guards were now said to let his friends in, it also did away of the chance of the Christian brothers in Jerusalem being bribed in order to service Paul. Okay? So a lot of things that occur there, that's kind of interesting as you look at Felix making that commandment, because he knew all those things. He knew all those things. Okay, so let's move on here. I think we can move on. What time is my watch is dead? Whew. Okay, maybe we won't move on, you guys. So next week, we will finish the trial with him, and we'll finish 24 and possibly go into 25. But you'll find that what happens next is very interesting as we start looking into Felix's life and to his third wife and their interest in Paul. And for what reasons were they interested in hearing from Paul? Because we'll find that he was called before them many times to testify and to talk to them about Jesus. Okay, let's close in prayer. Our Father, as we come to you today, we pray that these words, Father, will help us, guide us in understanding what was going on. Understanding, too, that all of these trials and tribulations that were hitting your new church, and yet they were faithful. Let us be also faithful as we face our trials in life and think back on all of these things that have been taking place, things that are taking place now, and may we remain faithful to you. In Christ's name, amen.